I'm Bethany McDonald, a producer in the audience engagement team at State Library Victoria. On behalf of the library, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. I'd like to give a warm welcome to State Library members, Grattan Institute members, and today's speakers, and welcome to everyone joining us here online. I'm pleased to be here this evening to introduce this conversation, Making Time for Great Teaching, presented as part of our outstanding partnership program series, The Policy Pitch. I'm representing the State Library this evening, but I also have both a professional and personal interest in this topic, and I appreciate the policy challenges in this area. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. The past couple of years have revealed to many people, particularly in Victoria, the enormous amount of work that teachers do behind the scenes. Parents of school-aged children, colleagues of parents of school-aged children, neighbours of school-aged children have more than likely witnessed the joys of remote learning at some stage, or at least heard them in the background as Jared, the sports teacher, yelled out words of encouragement to 5-year-olds trying to do burpees for the first time. The one thing that I think really shone through was a new appreciation for how hard a teacher's job can be. They're not just babysitting the kids for 6.5 hours a day. They're teaching them, engaging them, stimulating their minds, differentiating lesson content, providing feedback, attempting to answer questions that inevitably become statements, and it takes much longer than 6.5 hours per day. It is clear that teachers in Australian schools don't get enough time to prepare well for class, and student performance is suffering as a result. Teacher workloads have blown out in recent decades, and many teachers are now too stretched to do everything that we ask of them. So what are some of the strategies that are needed to tackle these problems? Our panel of policy experts will lead the discussion today with reference to Grattan Institute's latest report, Making Time for Great Teaching, which identifies 3 reform directions the government should adopt. For us in the library world, that means stepping up to the new, constantly evolving needs of our communities. It's been a slow process of easing back into life in the city, and one of the most exciting things has been seeing school groups return on excursions, including our first on-site student programs at State Library Victoria just 2 weeks ago. This year, as well as our on-site programs, we're continuing to offer online programs for families and schools. Originally designed to support these communities during periods of remote learning, these programs continue to be popular as we adapt to the new normal in our society. All of our programs for schools align with the Victorian curriculum, and many are focused on information literacy and research skills. Our Research Essentials for Secondary Students workshop help students in years 7 to 10 to look beyond Google and find reliable information online. And we also offer workshops and intensive webinars for VCE students. These are just a couple of examples. Our autumn program, Changemakers, celebrates the bold, the brave, and those who change hearts and minds with their powerful new ideas. You can find our full suite of education programs on the SLV website. The library sector has never been more vital in supplementing formal education and training. Our programs are designed to engage and inspire all learners. In fact, I encourage all of you to take a look at the reading list our librarians have provided for this event with some further reading on tonight's topic. Don't forget that professional reading can count towards your professional learning hours for VIT registration. And so to our panel. Leading tonight's discussion is Adam Carey, Education Editor at The Age. Adam is joined by Danny Pinchas, General Manager, Teaching and School Leadership at AITSL, the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership. Also Emma Lindsay, a Deputy Principal from Southwest Sydney, and Jordana Hunter, Education Program Director at Grattan Institute. It's an excellent panel and a critical conversation to have. Please make them welcome as I hand over to Adam to lead today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And like you, I'm also a parent who gained new insights and enhanced admiration for the work that teachers do over the past 2 years of being in and out of remote learning. It was a very educational experience for parents as well. As an education journalist, I sit outside the teaching profession, but I spend much of my working day trying to make sense of it. So I guess it gives me a bit of a unique perspective there. And one of the things that constantly strikes me when I speak with teachers is just the sense of the sheer crushing volume of tasks that many of them have, and which often don't actually involve teaching. You know, they're swim supervisors, they're yard duty managers, they've been contact tracers, they're HEPA filter cleaners, they deal with student welfare, and always an inordinate amount of paperwork and regulatory requirements they have to meet. It's no wonder that more than 90% of them told the Grattan Institute in its most recent report that they don't have enough time to prepare their lessons well. And of course, it's not just teachers, but most importantly, students who suffer when their teachers are unable to put adequate time into their lessons. So this is the subject of the Grattan Institute's latest report, Making Time for Great Teaching. I'll be moderating a panel of 3 education experts to discuss this urgent problem in Australian schools. I'm joined by Emma Lindsay, proud Southwestern Sydney Deputy Principal and Teach for Australia alumni, currently leading the design work for a Teach for Australia program targeting educational inequity in New South Wales schools. Danny Pinchas is General Manager Teaching and School Leadership at AITSL and has more than a decade of experience as an educational leader, including within the Victorian Education Department and in remote communities in the Kimberley. And finally, Jordana Hunter, the Education Program Director at Grattan, with an extensive background in economics and education policy, and who was co-author of this report. I'm really looking forward to hearing their insights and some of your questions in the audience too. Welcome to our 3 panelists and to our audience. Jordana, could you please give us all a brief overview of the report?
Thanks so much, Adam. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, Bethany, for the State Library of Victoria's support for Grattan in this program. I'm just going to share my screen now and just talk really briefly, a bit of a whirlwind tour of the Grattan reports. There are actually 2 reports that we published at the end of January: Making Time for Great Teaching, How Better Government Policy Can Help, and Making Time for Great Teaching, A Guide for Principals. And these reports really had their genesis, I guess, in some work we did at Grattan in 2014, where we tried to understand, how schools could go about creating more time for professional learning for teachers, which is really critical for teachers to improve their practice. I have to say, 8 years later, schools are still struggling to find time for great professional learning and professional practice for teachers. And I think these reports are particularly time critical given the experience we've had over the last 2 years with COVID, where, we've all seen how much pressure teachers and schools have been under, and also how important teachers having the time to be prepared for the classroom really is for student outcomes. And I can also speak from experience as a mother of 3 school-aged children myself. So we really wanted to understand the workload challenges that teachers are facing, and we wanted to bring, I guess, an independent lens to that question. So Grattan's a non-partisan, independent public policy think tank. We can bring a national perspective that just, I think, adds that additional level of independence to some of the good work that's already been done by teacher unions and teacher associations and different state and territory organisations. So we wanted to understand how big a challenge workload is for teachers and what some of the options might be to address it. So I guess just before I sort of say too much, how do we get to this position? And I think we'll come back to this in the conversation that comes next. But I think there are 3 key factors that we talk about in the report. There really does seem to be an ever-expanding breadth of what we're asking schools to deliver. So we're seeing that on a number of fronts, be it new programs, the swimming programs that are particularly important in Victoria after a spate of really, sad drownings of children. That program was added to the curriculum. More work being done around resilience and mental health, and an additional kind of emphasis on physical health, obesity issues, bullying, and all of this is happening against a backdrop of increasingly mainstreaming special needs students in mainstream schools. So these are really positive developments, but it is changing, I guess, the breadth of what we're asking schools to deliver. I think we're also seeing some changes around our increased expectations for effective teaching. Teaching seems to be becoming increasingly a clinical, precise professional practice, highly evidence-based, data-driven, targeted to individual student needs, with close, monitoring and tracking of student progress. Again, these are good things. This is what we want, to boost outcomes for students. But it does sort of change the nature of the classroom teaching practice, and I think increases expectations for teachers in terms of their preparation. And finally, in some states and territories, we are seeing a reduction in the level of central supports for schools. So we've seen an increase in levels of autonomy for teachers and school leaders, and a decline, I guess, in the sorts of supports that systems are providing. And along with that autonomy, increased expectations about accountability and reporting. So, I think all of this has come together really for a perfect storm for teachers in terms of their workload. So our reports pull in research from a number of different dimensions. So we did case studies, focus groups, we interviewed a number of school leaders and teachers, and we also ran a really large survey. So we had 5,000 teachers respond to our survey in the middle of last year, a tremendous result across all states and territories and all sectors, and 440 school leaders as well, which was just fabulous. But, what was less fabulous, I guess, was the really strong message that came out of that survey around how much teachers are struggling to get to the core part of their job. So we heard 92% simply do not have time, always or frequently, to prepare for effective teaching in the classroom. And we know that, how well a teacher is prepared when they step into the classroom each day with their students is really important in terms of what those students will learn coming out of that classroom experience. So being prepared for the classroom really matters. 86% of teachers said that the workload around just that expectation for what effective teaching entails is simply too high. So in the qualitative comments, we heard a lot that they were really struggling with the data burden. They were struggling to meet the needs of a really wide range of student abilities in their classrooms. And they also didn't feel like they had enough support for students with complex needs. So this was really challenging. And they're things that we have to grapple with if we want our education systems to perform and meet the expectations we set for them. So this is the whirlwind tour of the report. I'll just note we had 3 really high directions for reform. So what we're asking governments to do is when they're thinking about how they set up and fund and organise their education systems, they take these 3 principles into account that will, we hope, address the workload problem better. The first is to let teachers teach. So, as Adam mentioned, in the classroom, teachers are pulled in so many different directions in schools. Often teaching is the last thing on their list of things to do. We need to get better at matching teachers' work to teachers' expertise. And our survey suggested that teachers were really open to a number of strategies for bringing the wider workforce in ways that can help teachers really focus on preparation for the classroom and buy them more time. We need to help teachers work smarter. So there's an administrative burden that teachers face without a doubt, but there's also issues around preparation for classroom teaching. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel that's still happening in schools, and this is taking up time that teachers just simply don't have. And finally, I think there's some issues around how we organise teachers' time in schools. So there are some challenges around, keeping class sizes really low. This is an expensive strategy. Often it's warranted, but not always. And sometimes if class sizes just lifted a little, there might be opportunities to invest in more release time. There's also some opportunities, I think, to better smooth the peaks and troughs of teacher work over the year. And we tested these options with teachers and we got some really strong positive responses. So hopefully we can touch on these a little bit later. I just will wrap up quickly by saying we have 2 really strong calls for action out of the report. The first is we want governments to invest $60 million to pilot and evaluate different ways of organising workforces in schools so that teacher workloads can be put on a sustainable basis. This is a drop in the ocean of what we spend on recurrent funding for schools each year, which is around $65 billion. It's less than 0.1% to do the work that we need to kind of get teaching on a sustainable footing. And finally, for school leaders, our principal report shows there's actually a lot that school leaders can do now. We don't want to let governments off the hook, but there's a lot that principals can do to organise their human resources and their financial resources in schools that really prioritise time for effective teaching. So I'm going to stop there, Adam. Happy to come back to any of those issues. I'm going to stop sharing and we can see what the other panellists made of the report.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the wrap of your report there, Jordana. Emma, Lindsay, I'll start with you, if I may. You've been a teacher for more than 10 years. You're currently a deputy principal. In that time, have you seen teacher workloads become more unmanageable? Does something need to change, or is it an issue that is manageable?
Thanks, Adam. Look, I think quite clearly the data that Jordana just ran us through speaks for itself, that workloads are not manageable. It certainly feels on the ground like they're unsustainable. The reporting, the endless list of things that, come out in a complex setting myself, meeting the needs of our students, their wellbeing needs, even before we get to the teaching and learning, is incredibly time consuming. We know that takes time to build into relationships, lots of wellbeing plans, behaviour supports, following through NCCD data, making sure that there is differentiated assessment, and again, coming back to programming. And then we have the issue of teachers on the ground and needing to, entice more into the profession. So it certainly feels at the moment, and as in the state of New South Wales and across the country, that it does feel at this point of teacher fatigue and burnout. Absolutely.
Okay. Now, another point that Jordana raised there is the issue of support for struggling students with complex needs. 74% of teachers surveyed said they didn't get enough support for struggling students. You work in a school that serves a disadvantaged community. Tell us about what this means for teachers and for their work.
Absolutely. Look, for teachers, we know that the role of relationships is vital, because if you can build trust and that relationship with the student and their wellbeing needs are met, then they're in a place where they can learn and they can thrive and grow. But to get to that point, that takes time. And I know that there are parts in the report that say we could perhaps outsource, some of the supervision in the playgrounds or sport. But it's actually in those moments where we have roll call and we spend the time with the kids and we get to really know them, or we see them in the playground and we build up wellbeing credits and we know them and value them, and then can follow up. Because what it actually means in terms of time, and we saw this a lot during periods of remote learning, is the calls home, the check-ins on emails, the importance of social media platforms for our staff, that suddenly we did a quick pivot like the rest of the nation did, and we found ourselves communicating with students over different channels that we never thought we would, to make sure, are they okay? Are your needs met? Do we need to put you in touch with a family referral service? Do you need a food pack? Let alone uniform or getting down to the curriculum. So absolutely, it takes more time. I think there is the possibility to outsource that, but at the same time, those moments that we get outside of teaching really help us with the teaching. So we need a multi-pronged approach to this, for sure.
Okay. As a deputy principal, you work a lot with junior teachers at the start of their career. I guess also in your work with Teach for Australia, you will do the same thing. Are there any particular workload challenges that new teachers face?
Absolutely. Look, I was a career changer myself, and there is nothing quite like teaching. It's tough. We can do tough stuff, but it's really about the overwhelm of time. I mean, currently where it sits, beginning teachers come in, they've had a couple of years at university and a couple of short pracs, and then you're in suddenly, not just with curriculum, but suddenly, roll call and accreditation and all the other little bits and pieces that come with being in a school. A lot of the work that we've done in our setting and also within our broader network is about managing teachers' time and their own expectations. So a lot of that demonstrates the core role of coaching and mentoring that we play in the school day to day. And sometimes that's as simple as a whiteboard up in the staff room that has do, decide, delete, and delegate, because you can't do everything. You want to have a really pretty classroom when you first come in, and laminating is incredibly cathartic on its own, but is that something that's worth the time? We've found some really great resources. There's Together Teacher, if people haven't heard about that. Maya Haik Merlin, a US educator, has these wonderful resources about mapping your week priorities on a page. And it's not just this classroom and the school priorities, but also putting time in for your personal priorities as well, so that beginning teachers or even experienced teachers, we don't form these really bad habits of, I'm going to martyr myself to the work at the expense of my family or my mental health. So we certainly find the value in the coaching and mentoring to constantly go, okay, what are you doing with your time? In my own career, I had a brilliant TFA mentor, and she sits on my shoulder 14 years later, that we have to make your minutes match your mission. Do you need to do that, Emma? Is this really important? Is this your mission, and does that align to it? Or are you better having 2 nights a week where you do no work? So I think the real core role that we have is coaching and mentoring in the early stages of our career, so that we don't get into these bad habits.
Okay, thanks, Emma. And Danny Pinchas, moving to you. You've now had several roles as a teacher, as a school leader, and you're now focused on supporting schools. Drawing on your own experience, do you believe teacher workload is a problem? And if so, which aspects of it should worry us most?
Thanks, Adam. I think as Jordana went through the data that they collected, and there's a lot of alignment with data that at AITSL we put out around in a workforce characteristics report, where 95% of teachers are reporting unpaid overtime. Full-time teachers, I think the average was over 16 hours per week during term time. And that really resonated with me, going back to my experiences as a teacher. The intensity of workload really isn't balanced as it is, my current job at AITSL or in a lot of other sectors. I think when term time is on, teachers, as was reported, are struggling to make those minutes their mission, and the balance is really difficult to maintain. I remember personally, as soon as school holidays commenced, I would come down with tonsillitis like clockwork, like to the point where I would, as soon as the symptoms would start, I'd stock up on penicillin and self-medicate, so that, rather than drive the 2 hours to the local doctor. So that kind of intensity is a reality, and I think there is a lot of scope. And I really liked in the report the aspect of working smarter. I think there is scope to make improvements in how we work. I think you asked the question, what worries me most? It's what we're not willing to let go of. Each additional requirement or task that we ask of our teachers on its own, assessed individually, might make sense. But when looked, the teacher is the one that sees the whole and sees all those requests come together on their time. And I think there's more at a few levels, at a system level, at a national level, at a school leader level, as Jordana mentioned. I think there's a lot that can be done. And at an individual teacher level, a little bit to what Emma was saying, how do you manage and prioritise? AITSL did a review into red tape recently and put out a school workload reduction kit, which just goes to some of those, tips and tricks in how schools and individuals and systems can manage this, but also highlight some of the practices that are happening across jurisdictions to really tackle red tape. So that is one starting point, but it is a challenge, I agree.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about what I think is one of the more contentious aspects of the report. And I say that because The Age has, we have a Facebook page where we put our education stories up. And when we published our report on this report, it went gangbusters. It set, I'd have to say, a record in my time in terms of engagement, comments, and so on. So it really tapped into, it struck a nerve. I guess a lot of our audience on that page are teachers, but I guess one of the responses that probably got the most pushback was the notion that teachers could stop reinventing the wheel, that they could, in terms of lesson planning and preparation, that others could do that and give more time for them to do pure teaching. Many, I guess, saw that preparation planning work as a core part of their role as teachers. What's your view on that issue?
Yeah, it's a really good one. And I think, again, drawing both on my experience as a teacher, but then also currently in our, I guess, national bird's eye view, which we're privy to, I think we want to move, sorry, I'll go back a step. Teaching is a complex job. It's a profession, and I don't want us to see us move back to a vocation. I want to see us lean into that complexity. Does that mean having control of lessons and lesson planning? And I think to an extent it does need, we don't want teachers to be just passive in the scope and sequence of what they're teaching in classrooms. But I think wherever we're creating lessons or ideas or, to bring into the classroom, we are drawing on others' expertise. We are drawing on what our colleagues do, what Google says when we hit the search engine. But I think there's value in doing that in a smarter, more supported way for teachers. I'm not saying to take teachers out of the decision making. Actually, that's where I want to see them, front and center. Their professional judgments in how they apply those lessons for their context, how they apply the assessments and understand where their students are and where they need to go next. That's the core work I see of a teacher. That's where their profession comes to the fore and what the best value add that they can bring. So I don't think it's a carte blanche. We want every lesson in every classroom looking identical, but I also think there's a lot of scope to provide not only the access to the lessons for teachers, but I guess having some sense of the quality around those lessons and making sure that they are based on evidence, that they have been tested, and then get the teacher to make that professional judgment of how and when to use that within their context and obviously within the school and system that they're operating within.
Just on that, the report does suggest that expectations for teachers have grown over time, particularly around evidence-based, data-informed practices and addressing individual student needs. Is this style of teaching more complex and more time intensive for teachers? And if so, is it worth it?
So I guess I said before that I think that we need to lean into that complexity. I think it is more complex, and I think that's a great thing. We need to create the conditions for teachers to succeed in that environment, though. And that's where I think there's work to be done. So I think we do need to analyse data from our students. We need to create time for our teachers to work together to understand and make judgments on where to go next. I don't want to see us with, I guess, one of the themes in the report, let them teach, I think is great, as long as we've got a good sound definition around teach. I don't want to see us go back to close the classroom door and a privatised version of teaching. I want to see us work more collaboratively and for the structures to meet that. Meet what the evidence is saying is effective practice. So yeah, I think we've come a long way. What I think we haven't done is stop a lot of the practices that we have picked up along the journey.
Okay, Jordana Hunter, the report calls for a number of reforms. Which would you say are the most critical reforms that need to happen?
Thanks, Adam. And thanks to the other panelists for the really insightful comments so far. There's a lot in there, I think, to reflect on further. I think for us, the top priority, I think, for government is to really get a handle on how we're using the wider workforce in schools and how we're deploying them in ways that help teachers focus on highly effective teaching in the classroom. So if we have a look at actually how the workforce in schools has developed since 1990, compared to students, the number of teaching assistants and administrators has more than doubled since 1990. It's that growth in that workforce has significantly outpaced the growth in teachers. And we're also seeing the number of specialists in schools more than double in that time as well. So it's not just a question of throwing more people at the problem. The question, I think, is have we done the hard work to think about how we integrate and deploy that staff? I think in terms of teaching assistants, we do profile an example of a school that has used teaching assistants really effectively to do some of that supervision work, yard duty and extracurricular supervision. So that knowledge of the student behavioural issues and kind of the challenges that they're bringing the whole student is kept inside the school. It's not just a question of sort of outsourcing it to a separate workforce that might come in, but it is saying that for teachers, it's about finding that balance. So, you know, they do some extracurricular supervision, but not perhaps as much as they're currently doing. And you know, in our survey, we heard 68% of teachers saying they could save 2 hours a week if non-teaching staff were doing some of that. So it's about that balance. So I think that work is important work. You know, we have 9,500 schools across the country. We can't expect every single school to iterate themselves to finding the best practice approaches in these areas. I do think governments need to set up and do that research work around how we use those workforces effectively. I think the second one is around curriculum and lesson planning. I know that's been a really interesting issue, Adam, from the Ages Facebook page and also from the feedback we've heard from teachers. You know, in our survey, 88% of teachers said they could save 3 hours a week if they had access to high quality instructional materials. So there clearly is a demand. You know, at the same time, we know there's a lot of resources available on the internet, for example. So I think there's a question, you know, why is it not meeting their needs? Is it not sufficiently high quality? Is it not adapted to the types of students that they're serving? But just as Danny says, you know, I think increasingly high quality teaching is a team sport. It's a team effort, and it makes a lot of sense for a school to have a school-wide approach where the best ideas about teaching and learning are synthesized and brought together, and teachers can then spend their time, instead of making things from scratch, improving iteratively the work, that the lesson plans they've got, and thinking about how they're going to deliver them in the classroom and how the individual students need additional support. So they're the top two. I might stop there because I'm speaking a lot, but you know, they're the top two. And I will just say lastly, I do hope principals, if they've got time, have a look at the principal report, because you know, the other priority really is to support principals to think about that prioritisation work they can do in their own schools. And there are some really interesting case studies there that principals can draw on and sort of get the thinking cap on about what might shift the dial for teachers in their context.
All right, thanks, Jordana. And Emma, Lindsay, I'll ask you, just because you're yet to have your say on this question. What do you make of this notion of lesson planning and so on being, I guess, removed as a responsibility from teachers personally? And also, how do you believe your staff would respond to this notion?
Yeah, thanks. Good point. Look, I think it's not about going to one extreme and saying teachers don't have any agency, you have to use this material, you're a robot and a facilitator. But I do think most definitely there is a need to have, it's economies of scale, right, is to have more high quality, and I think that's the point, Jordana, not just that it's a quick Google search, here's something with resources that don't quite fit the context, or is just a bit of a taste and not enough, but really high quality, comprehensive programs with resources so that the time can be spent on differentiating for the students in our class and making the adjustments for those learning and wellbeing needs. I think these are some of the silver linings that have come from COVID, is that we can see when we shift from this is my classroom and my program that I've poured hours of my own time into and I don't want to share with anyone else, to, well, actually, why don't we kind of pull our resources together and think together and plan together so that we've got the time. So, you know, I think it's, like Danny said, sort of leaning into this complexity and finding space within that tension, because there absolutely is time that can be saved.
And Emma, just on the point, I guess, of teaching time being crowded out by other responsibilities, a growing list of responsibilities, many of them very worthy ones. Jordana mentioned swimming lessons. It's very recently been confirmed that consent will form part of the new Australian curriculum. Again, a very worthy thing to tackle in classrooms. But again, it's another example of something that, you know, once upon a time would have been widely viewed as the purview of you know, families to teach that sort of thing. It's another, I guess, task that's now being put with schools and teachers. Is there an issue, I guess, particularly when we hear repeatedly of crowded curriculums, of these sorts of subjects being, I guess, reallocated from parents and guardians onto teachers?
Look, it's a good point. I think we have to work in partnership with families. And again, in the community that I serve and the community that I work, it's really important that we are able to tackle some of these issues together and not just assume that that's the remit of the family, because that family isn't equitable across the country, or even between postcodes. So I do think the curriculum can be crowded. I do think, there are some things like taking debating, for example, that is another thing, but equally it's like icing on the cake for a staff member to be able to have that great win and camaraderie with their students outside of the classroom. I think the problem is being able to, at the moment, a big issue is being able to backfill and have casual cover to be able to cover the class, because at the moment for teachers it feels like, well, their class may be on minimal supervision, for example, and so they want to go out and do these things, these really rich, great opportunities to connect with kids and higher level opportunities, but they're worried about, well, what's going to happen in the classroom, and am I going to have to cover that work when I get back again tomorrow? I think you may be on mute, Adam.
Excuse me there. The case studies in the report suggested that sometimes school leaders and teachers can be their own worst enemies, taking on lots of new initiatives or setting themselves very high standards when it comes to beautiful classroom displays, for example. Are there things schools and teachers should cut back on?
Most definitely. I think we can, like I said, we can be our own worst enemies and we can become martyrs to it. And I think this really comes down to the power of having a coaching and a mentoring culture, and indeed a broader culture of high quality performance and improvement within the school, so that leaders, faculty, head teachers or heads of staff, and those with beginning teachers can kind of keep each other accountable and go, well, that's really nice, but remember, these are the things, these were your goals that we're working on, or why don't we do this together? Or, in our scope and sequence and in our program, why don't we display student work instead of us spending time, like we said, laminating and have everything perfect, because we can better use our time. So it's really about the people that we're surrounded by and the culture in the school.
Okay, thank you. And Danny, Pinchas, the Grattan report has called for investigations and pilots of different ways of bringing teaching and non-teaching staff together in schools to ease workload and to improve outcomes. What do you think are the pros and cons of that approach? Do you have thoughts about the types of investigations that could be most helpful?
Yeah, I think, pilots are a good idea. I think I'm wary of our natural inclination to learn from pilots. We often say, well, my context is different. And that's true, of course, to an extent. But I think when we set out any pilots, we've got to be cognizant of how are we setting this up to actually inform and bring to scale, rather than just having bespoke projects that are only going to be relevant in that specific context. I think also we need to look at what's come before. So, as I mentioned, we've surfaced quite a few case studies of effective workload reduction practices at an employer, at a school level. And I think that's a good starting point before you start, again, reinventing the wheel in a pilot rather than a lesson in this case. And then, let's look at what flexibility can occur also within the current structures, because that's, I think, coming back to what you were saying before around, school leaders and teachers sometimes being our own worst enemy. There are things that can happen right here, right now. And I think, Jordana, you mentioned that in the report, that are no cost and should be able to be, see some quick wins, which would get people on board. And I think that's where we should start. The other one I'd probably touch on that's really important in all of this is communication. I think a lot of that idea of crowded curriculum and increasing expectations comes with, when I'll put my parent hat on, us as parents and the broader community's expectations of school to do everything that, school was to them, plus more what we've learned in the past. So I think there's a big challenge and a big role in how do we bring the community and parents along with us to actually say this is what quality teaching and learning looks like, in 2022, because there's a natural hesitation to be conservative and want to have everything, basically.
Okay. And Danny, you've been a teacher, you're now in an educational leadership role outside of schools. Do you think that school leaders are getting all of the training and support that they need to tackle organisational issues, resource management issues in their schools? And how can school leaders get the support that they need?
Yeah, I think this has been our work with, in particular, principal associations, but also employers and school leaders themselves have highlighted this as an issue in terms of actually, you know, when you look at the breadth of the role expected of a principal, and, you know, Jordana referenced the principal report that they did, it is quite significant, and there's a need for quite a lot of learning to move from a teaching to a leadership role. And now jurisdictions, employers have had this as a focus really quite intently for a number of years. You know, in Victoria and the department, I know they've introduced VAPA, the Principal Preparation Program, and I think something that we've found in our work at AITSL has been the importance of ensuring that we're thinking about leadership development, not just when someone is in the job of principal or even in the job of assistant principal, but right through from when they first join the school as a graduate. What opportunities are we giving to our teachers that expose them to leadership, expose them to running a budget, expose them to managing a program? I think that's a core part of teaching and leadership, and I wouldn't want us to shy away from it. And then it just makes that transition into formal leadership all the more successful. So it's not a sink or swim. So I think there are things we can do, but I also think we're doing quite a lot in that space across Australia.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to questions from our audience now for the last part of our webinar. There are some questions that have been submitted while we've been speaking and some others that were submitted in advance. I'll try to do a mix from the two piles. Firstly, Nikki Patton writes, do you think governing bodies of schools need to step up to reduce the compliance burden on schools, particularly in the independent schools sector? Jordana.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Nikki, for that question. It's a really interesting question. Look, I think I've got a two-pronged answer to this question. I think, you know, the first answer is yes. Of course, government bodies really should make sure that the compliance burden is as minimal as possible. And, you know, I think it's good practice for governments to think about, you know, not just, you know, each little bit of compliance policy that an individual team inside a big government bureaucracy might work on, but actually sit down and look at all of them across the board and make sure they're not doubling up, make sure they're as streamlined as possible, make sure they're only asking for information that they will actually use in some way that someone actually reads and checks off. Otherwise, you know, it's just a paper pushing exercise that's not going to change anything on the ground. So that is definitely an issue. And it's an issue that we hear time and time again from teachers and principals. I guess, you know, what I would say, though, the second part of my answer is that, you know, a degree of compliance is a feature of the educational landscape. Schools deal with a very vulnerable client population. They're dealing with children. A lot of those children are very vulnerable children. They're also dealing with large sums of public money. And, you know, the Australian population has expectations around the appropriate discharge of that funding and, you know, the protections around children in institutional settings. So there's a significant degree of that compliance burden that's not going away. The question is making it fit for purpose and then making sure that it's dealt with in ways that are as efficient as possible. And, you know, if that compliance burden is really essential, I think it's up to governments to be thinking about how they staff schools and how they fund schools to be able to provide that reporting that governments can use.
Okay, thank you, Jordana. And a couple of people have submitted this essentially the same question, but in different ways. John Allen and Colin Lillywhite both ask, will schools change fundamentally as a result of COVID? What do you think will be the long-term changes in the education sector? Emma Lindsay.
I think it would be fantastic if we had a crystal ball, but we don't. What I will say is that as a profession, we did some massive heavy lifting, and we should be so proud and impressed with ourselves that nearly overnight, I know people don't want to hear pivot, but we completely flipped on its head what we thought. Oh, you couldn't work remotely, you couldn't work from home, we couldn't do this. And it's not been without its challenges, ensuring that there were devices for students and connectivity for students and families who didn't have it. It's an uneven playing ground out there for students. we did it, and we can do it. And we saw the power in my own setting of collaboration, being able to come together and take ownership of all students, and not just, like we were saying before, hang on to, I have to invent the wheel every time for every unit for myself, but that we can work together. So I think there's this enormous power of possibility that exists in the face of remote learning, and we can do it, and we can do tough stuff.
Okay, this is a good question that gets back to brass tacks of why we're all here on this panel. Samuel Cowley asks, how do you define great teaching? Are prevailing conceptions of the profession's key aims a barrier to performance? Danny?
Well, I'd start with the teacher standards, bit of bias there, because they define what we expect the knowledge and skills of teachers across a range of career stages. And I think they encompass all the complexity that we've been talking about over the last hour or so. So defining quality teaching, and the standards work at a high level, I acknowledge, and to be applied, for every teacher in every context. So it's going to look different. It's going to look different depending on your student cohort or your or the context of your school. But I think that's the starting point. I think when we, which all governments did agree to and implement in a variety of ways, I think the important thing with the teacher standards, whilst they're used for regulatory purposes at initial teacher education, at registration, and then on to certification at higher career stages, the feedback we get is a really big, the big power in those teacher standards is around how teachers use them to self-reflect on where they are and where they need to go next. So understanding that they're not just focusing on the here and now, on that 9 a.m, on that first class, and it's not just about the putting out the spot fires, but about their own development over a period of time, and what they need to support that development is really important. And a lot of that comes down to good professional learning, good connection with colleagues, good feedback on their classes, so team teaching, observation, enough opportunities to be able to actually develop as a professional, like we expect in every other profession, that we have access to that expertise and to help us develop and grow.
Okay, thank you, Danny. And this is a comment, but it's an interesting one. I'd be interested to get your perspective. Julie Lay, many materials and commercial textbooks are not quality, often superficial or poorly written. Teachers need new materials that are adjustable, evidence-based, with multiple pathway suggestions. Emma Lindsay, what do you think of the quality of materials? Is it sometimes a problem?
I would agree with Julie, absolutely. I would say that when there are changes in curriculum, departments will put out sample programs and resources, and that's great, but we need it ongoing, not just, because the geography syllabus has been updated or there's a new stage 6 English text. We need this ongoing. There's great work done by Teachers Association. So the English Teachers Association, for example, produced really, really good resources, but that's incumbent upon the school being a member and subscribing to that. Imagine if all schools had access to that and it wasn't just at the hands of one particular faculty head teacher, for example. So I completely agree with Julie.
Okay. Another comment from Joe Alvaro. An important issue of classroom management issues and challenges is the stress this causes, especially for young teachers. Sometimes teachers are left to struggle on their own. Joint responsibility is missing. Program for International Student Assessment Data, PISA, regularly suggests that Australian classrooms are among the most disorderly in the world. Jordana, does your report have anything to say about this issue?
Yeah, look, this is a really, really interesting issue. We didn't ask any questions specifically on classroom behaviour management, but it did come through in the qualitative responses to the surveys. So, teachers did raise that they had, concerns about the significant breadth, I guess, in terms of student achievement, and also the breadth in terms of behaviour expression in the classroom, and how they were really spending a lot of time thinking about behaviour management when they really would have preferred to have been spending time thinking about teaching and learning. So it's definitely a challenge. I think, it comes back to that question of the use of specialists in schools as well. So, in our case study schools, we did see schools that were using specialists in really interesting ways. So instead of using specialists to provide, one-on-one consultations with students, they were trying, where possible, to be using those specialists such as behavioural experts, speech pathologists, etc., to be working with teachers to, improve as much as possible the quality of the universal classroom teaching practice. And the theory behind that was that if you can really help the teacher develop, their classroom practice skills, hopefully we head off some of these issues down the track that might require that specialist to be focused on one-on-one intervention with individual students. So that's one example of, from our survey, how we might tackle that issue. But it's a really big concern. And, I think just going back a step, obviously the causes of student behavioural challenges in the classroom are really varied. And, I don't want to be too simplistic about it. But one of the causes, I think, is a really significant gap in learning achievement between higher achieving and lower achieving students. So, if you've got kids that are really struggling with literacy, for example, and they can't read the worded problems effectively in a maths class, or they can't engage with the text in an English class, those kids are going to be discouraged, and it's going to be much more challenging for them to engage productively in class. So thinking about how we can use that workforce to intervene early, keep that gap between the highest ability kids and the kids that are struggling, manageable, I think that could actually go a long way to helping the classroom teacher, deal with some of those workload burdens that come from having to tailor everything to every individual student in their class.
Okay, we hear a lot about student wellbeing, very important. Senli Wong has a question more in the area of teacher wellbeing. What do you recommend for teachers' wellbeing so that they can do great teaching and be in tip-top shape? Danny Pinchas, teacher wellbeing.
Yeah, it's a hallmark of teachers that we often don't think about ourselves till last. And I think, I think about the flight safety video, put your oxygen mask on yourself before your child. And I would strongly agree that teachers need to do more around self-care, and then we need to do more to help them in this space, not only because of the last 2 years of COVID, but just because of this increasing complexity and managing all the variables that happen within a school setting. I think going from being in a classroom setting to being in an office or a home office environment, there's much less many less variables in the day-to-day. I don't have I can pretty confidently expect what other adults in the room are going to be saying and the reactions that they have. As a teacher, you just, and I mentioned before that stress of term time and then the letdown at holiday time, I think we can do more to smooth out the job. And that's where I think some of the suggestions in the report around flexibility within schools is a really good idea. How can I help teachers have a more, where possible, a more predictable day? How can I relieve some of those stresses to make sure that they've got that self-care, that they've got the time to do the planning, to do the collaboration with colleagues, to do the venting that they need to do, and really make sure that they are looking after themselves, because otherwise, we do get teacher burnout and we see people leaving the profession. And I think there's so many beautiful things about the profession that we want to make sure we accentuate and make that the experience of everyone in an ideal world. But there are things that I think we can do right here, right now.
I think we might have time for just one more question before Jordana makes her closing remarks. So, Jordana, a question for you. Time is important, but so are class sizes. Why are we locked into an either-or scenario? Your report seems to advocate an increase in class sizes. Many in the profession advocate for the opposite. Is that correct? Why would you call for what would be the benefits of increasing class sizes?
Yeah, look, I think on the face of it, this can seem a little counterintuitive. So I'll talk you through the reasoning. I think everything else being equal, if you ask a teacher, if you ask me, would you prefer a larger class or a smaller class? Everyone's going to put up their hand and say they want the smaller class. That makes a lot of sense. But of course, we're not in the world where everything is equal. We're in the world where keeping class sizes small is a very expensive policy, and it can reduce the amount of money that's available to invest in other things. So we know that actually class sizes across Australia vary really significantly. So there are some schools that are running classes of 12, 13, 14 students. There are other schools that are running classes of, above 30 students. So we've got this wide variation across the country. In some instances, keeping classes really small is the right decision for the children in those classes. I'm thinking particularly in early years, classes with children with really acute learning challenges or behavioural challenges. Keeping those classes small makes a lot of sense. But there are other instances where letting classes increase a little, and I'm talking, an additional 3 students here, could really free up significant headroom in a school budget, and that money could then be invested in time for teachers to have release from face-to-face teaching time in particular to deal with some of these workload issues. So this is not a question that teachers are asked very often. They're not asked how they would feel about these different trade-offs. They're normally just asked, would you prefer a big class or a small class? So in our survey, we actually put the trade-off to teachers. We asked them their thoughts about having a slightly larger class in exchange for an additional 2 hours of release time each week. And, the results were really positive. So 60 to 80%, depending on how we formulated the question, were in favour of the larger class if they had an additional 2 hours of release time each week. So it's not, the larger class and no release time. It's the larger class in exchange for additional release time each week. So we do think this is an option that some schools could explore now within current EBA frameworks. And that's why, we think it's important that schools have that flexibility at the school level to make the decision that's right for teachers and it's right for students, rather than sticking with quite rigid class size maximums across the country or across the jurisdiction, I should say.
Okay, thanks, Jordana. I think it's time for me to wrap things up. This has been a terrific discussion. I've really enjoyed it as your moderator. Thank you very much, Emma, Lindsay and Danny Pinchas and Jordana Hunter, for sharing your valuable insights with us. I'll just pass to Jordana to make some closing remarks, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for guiding us through that discussion. I really enjoyed it, and thank you to the audience for all of their questions. And thank you, Emma and Danny, for sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us today. I really appreciate any opportunity, I think, to speak to teachers and school leaders and to have both of you join us on the panel with your experience from the coalface in schools, but also with the various leadership hats that you're wearing now has been really valuable. Grattan staff spend a lot of time thinking about how governments can best support teachers and students, and so that we can set up children for success and close the stubborn equity gap that continues to persist in Australia. In the education program, which I lead, this has included our most recent research project into the underlying drivers and responses to unmanageable teacher workloads, as well as our 2020 research report on COVID catch-up, which was a key driver of over $1.2 billion of investment in catch-up tutoring programs in New South Wales and Victoria alone. We're really proud of that intervention in support of Australian students struggling with the pandemic. If you appreciate our independent research and advocacy and you'd like to see more of it, please consider donating to the Grattan Institute. Your donations make a really tremendous difference to the scope of the research that we can do, just like our survey for this latest report with over 5,000 responses. We're very grateful to all of our supporters, both large and small. So thank you again for your time tonight. Please continue the conversation on this important issue and have a wonderful evening.